it can all kind of be wrapped up into this theme of God's faithfulness versus Israel's fear. And if that isn't the story that many, many of us live in this day and age, right? God's faithfulness versus our anxiety, God's faithfulness versus our worries about the future or our children or all kinds of things. Will the people trust that Heavenly Father is going to keep his promises to them? And that might be a pretty familiar question to you too. Is God going to keep the promises that he made to you? And that requires an incredible amount of not just you having trust, but growing in trust over the course of like your 40 years or your time in the wilderness. So it turns out that you can get the people out of Egypt in one day, but it takes about 40 years to get Egypt out of the people. Hello and welcome to FAIR's Come Follow Me for Old Testament Year. I am Jennifer Roach Lees, and today we are talking about the book of Numbers. Don't be afraid, Numbers is not about math. It's not even actually all that much about numbers, although there are some in this book. It is the amazing story of Israel as they wander from Mount Sinai kind of all the way up into the edge of the promised land. So it's all the 40 years of wandering. But before we get going, I want to point out one verse in Numbers, kind of in my ongoing effort to get you to look at other translations outside of the King James Version. So Numbers is a great book for this because it kind of gets weird. Here's my example. It's Numbers 35:11. And in King James, it reads, "Then ye shall appoint for you cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the slayer may flee titteth, which killeth any person unawares." And you're probably like, what? What in the world is a modern person supposed to make? How are we supposed to get meaning out of that? Here's what the NIV says. "Select some towns to be your cities of refuge, to which a person who has killed someone accidentally may flee." Right? They're developing their law system and they want somewhere for people who basically commit manslaughter. They want them to go. They probably can't stay in the community. They need a city to go to. Absolutely crystal clear. So this is a completely classic example of the old language in NIV. That would have made sense when it was written in the 1600s. They would have known what that was saying, but we don't. A lot of those are words we don't even use anymore. We get so much more clarity when we put it in like scriptures for our language. It gets rid of the old language and it just makes the understanding plain. Anyway, on to the structure of Numbers. Do you know what it means to be in a liminal place? It's kind of this in-between place where you've left one spot, but you haven't yet arrived at your next place. We think of airports as being liminal places, right? You've gone through security, you're sitting at your gate, you're about as on your way as is in your power to be. When you board the plane, most things are no longer in your power. You've done everything you can do to leave the space you were in, but you are not yet at your new location. And it's kind of this strange place where everybody and everything is changing all around you. There's just thousands of people coming and going, and no one stays for long. But there you are. You've left, but you have not yet arrived. So as Israel leaves Mount Sinai, they've got their 10 Commandments, they've got the book of Leviticus in hand, and they head into the desert where they will wander, kind of unintentionally, for 40 years. It doesn't always go that well, right? But they've left one place. They're about to go to another place, but there's this long period of kind of, it's liminal. It's sort of nothing in between. In the book of Numbers, if you want an easy way to think of it, it's basically Israel's 40-year-long group project. Everybody keeps complaining. Nobody reads the instructions. And Moses is about one meltdown away from just walking out into the desert and leaving everyone. Now, I suspect, and if I'm wrong, please tell me in the comments, but I suspect that most Latter-day Saints have not spent much time in Numbers. The whole book gets 1 week of our attention every 4 years, and at least in this year, it's not even a Sunday where we have Sunday school. It's Relief Society or Elders Quorum. So if you are only relying on Sunday school weeks to read the scriptures, you could miss this one entirely. And it's sad because you'll miss out on some really, really good things that are incredibly relevant for you and for me today. Let me break the book down into some big sections for you. So the story of getting the people from Mount Sinai to the edge of the promised land, it happens in kind of three main geographic areas. Even though they're traveling this long route for 40 years, there's kind of three sections that they're in. And the first is they're still at Sinai, and that's the first 10 chapters of the book. And those chapters are all about, like, they're packing up the car, basically. They're getting ready to go. They're organizing the people. First, they take a census before they get ready to head out. They're like, let's make sure everybody's here. They also receive instructions on the Passover, which, as you know, is this annual remembrance of them leaving Egypt. It's still celebrated to this day, and they really want to, like, nail down some of the symbolism and the importance of that before they finally, like, trek off into the biggest part of their journey. These 10 chapters are kind of like the planning or packing stage of a project. You assign roles and responsibilities. You'll pack the car and I'll make sure the house is locked up. You get out Google Maps. You think about the places you might be stopping. And I don't know what your family vacations are like, but sometimes it all works really well on paper. And then things kind of start to fall apart when you're actually on the road. And that is a little bit of the feeling here. We're planning a great trip, but things start to happen. And the next section, it'll be Numbers 11 through 25. They're out in the wilderness. And all kinds of stuff happens. We get rebellion. We get challenges to Moses' authority. They send some spies up to the promised land who come back, and the people are terrified of the report that they bring back. We get the serpent on a pole that Moses raises up. We get a talking donkey. A lot of complaining about food and water, especially, sort of general complaining, but mostly about food and water. This section, it really shows us the people who are struggling to kind of adjust not only to the expectations of holiness that God laid before them, they're also struggling on how do we live in the desert as nomadic people. This is new to them. They used to live in Egypt. So they're figuring out how do we do this kind of nomadic lifestyle. But mostly, the theme in all of their struggles is they're struggling to trust Heavenly Father. Sometimes they trust Moses, and by extension, Heavenly Father, and lots of times they don't. They don't really trust the promise that the land will be theirs, that the process to get there is actually going to work. And during the book, we see them come to terms with what it means for them to go from Egypt into their own land. We actually see the original generation, they don't make it. They wander for 40 years. By the time they're there, everyone has died off. Their children and their grandchildren make it, which I won't spend a lot of time on this, but it is kind of this nice reminder. Sometimes we work for things really hard that we don't get to see the results of, but the next generation does, or the generation beyond that. We see this, absolutely, we see this in Numbers. They also have to face the loss of their beloved leader. While they rebel against him, they still are very, very devoted to him. Moses dies. They also make the transition from being this kind of nomadic people into a people who have to fight. They have to go to war. They have to battle the current inhabitants of their promised land. So they're not just going to be a wandering people anymore. And it's a lot. It's many, many, many transitions. There's all kinds of stuff going on for them. So it's rough on them. We'll give them some compassion. They're in a hard spot. The final section of the book, it's chapter 26 through the end, which is about 10 chapters. It takes place on the plains of Moab, is what they call it. And this is the new generation, the children and the grandchildren of the original generation entering the promised land. So what they do is they take a new census, kind of a fresh start. They figure out some inheritance laws, which they did not think they were going to have to do in the first place. They didn't expect that entire generation would have been gone. They have to deal with what the boundaries of the land are supposed to be. They have to learn to accept Joshua as their new leader after Moses dies. All three sections have a lot of transition. And there are some really interesting themes in the book. And what you start to see is this is a book about uncertainty and frustration and second chances, and as well as God's patience with human frailty. It can all kind of be wrapped up into this theme of God's faithfulness versus Israel's fear. And if that isn't the story that many, many of us live in this day and age, right? God's faithfulness versus our anxiety, God's faithfulness versus our worries about the future or our children or all kinds of things. Will the people trust that Heavenly Father is going to keep his promises to them? And that might be a pretty familiar question to you too. Is God going to keep the promises that he made to you? And that requires an incredible amount of not just you having trust, but growing in trust over the course of like your 40 years or your time in the wilderness. So we too, thousands of years later, sometimes wonder if God is really, really going to do the things that he said he was going to do for us and for our descendants. And the book of Numbers is a great place to kind of think through what that is like. It also kind of reads like this spiritual biography of a people learning very slowly and very painfully to trust the God who rescued them. And again, Israel stares down a promise from God, and instead of trusting, they pull back. The promise is clear, they look at it, they see it, and they get afraid, and they pull back from what God has promised them, not because God is unfaithful, but because fear feels pretty familiar to them. They were slaves in Egypt. They were a conquered people. They left with a lot of chaos and a lot of fear. They've been in the desert. Some bad things have already gone down, and they're scared. And yet God has said, here are the promises that I have for you. And so it's this tension between an anxious people and a God who's trying to lead them towards something really good. And there are 3 moments in the book that capture this struggle kind of with some heartbreaking clarity. And the first comes when, we already alluded to it a little bit, the 12 spies are sent out into the promised land, kind of get a lay of the land. Who's there? What are the cities like? What are the provisions like? They come back and give a report to the people. And God has already promised this land to Israel, already shown them his power in Egypt, already split the sea, already fed them in the wilderness. Yet when the spies come back and they describe fortified cities and giants who live there. In my opinion, what that probably means is people who are way better fed, they have way better nutrition, and they're not a people who've been wandering in the desert short on food sometimes for 40 years. So they have just grown better. To fortified cities and giants. And the people kind of collapse into panic. They cry through the night. They actually accuse God of bringing them out into the desert to die. And they have a proposal to solve all of this. And it is, they're going to elect a new leader that will take them back to Egypt. It's this defining moment of distrust. God offers them a future, but fear convinces them that even slavery is better than the anxiety of having to trust. And this crisis actually kind of becomes a turning point for them where the older generation does not trust in a lot of ways, and they are sentenced essentially to wander around until a new generation can kind of rise with some courage until the older generation all dies out. The second moment, it actually comes earlier in the book when the people are complaining about the food. It's every human's favorite thing to complain about, right? They're tired of the manna. God has provided this food that they can collect 6 days of the week. On the 6th day, they collect enough for 2 days for the 6th and 7th day. They're not just tired of manna, though they are. They're tired of depending on God for that level of daily provision. And what they do is they begin to kind of romanticize the menu back in Egypt. And they say, we remember the fish and the cucumbers. Oh, the cucumbers and the melons. And they speak as if Egypt was this gourmet buffet paradise rather than what it actually was for them, which was slavery, where they could be beaten, where their food could be taken away from them. We make a little bit of fun here, but their anxiety reveals something deeper, that they did not believe God could sustain them in a barren desert. Even Moses wavers a little bit here, right? Wondering how God could possibly provide meat for so many. But the issue here is not hunger. It's trusting God's ability to care for them when the resources look thin. Right? Today, we face this kind of struggle all the time, right? You sit down and you do your budget for the month and resources are a little thin and you've got to make a choice. Am I going to pay my tithing or aren't I? Am I going to trust that this command God has given me, if I obey it, somehow I'm going to get through my month? This is exactly what the people in Israel were going through. They did not believe God was going to be able to provide for them when they just looked around and saw nothing but sand. Turns out God does provide for them, but it's really hard for them in that moment. The third moment, and if you haven't read the book of Numbers before, you might not know this story, but it's a fantastic story. The third moment comes, they call it Korah's rebellion, when a group of leaders challenge Moses and Aaron. So obviously this is before Moses has died, and their complaint actually isn't about food. It isn't even about danger. It's about authority. And they absolutely refuse to believe that God has chosen Moses, and they refuse to accept the structure that God has established, and kind of insist on almost redefining holiness on their own terms. It's a crisis of trust in God's order, how God has set up their society. It's not just a crisis in Moses' leadership, although it is also that. So the story is found in Numbers 16. Go read it in the ESV or the NIV. You'll understand it pretty well. And it's kind of one of these super dramatic moments in the wilderness history because it exposes this deep is a fracture in the community. So Korah is a Levite. He's a priest. He gathers 250, we might call them influencers. He might call them, junior leaders. He gathers 250 influential people, and he's going to challenge Moses and Aaron's authority. Their accusations actually kind of sound reasonable and spiritual on the surface. And what the accusation is he says, all the congregation are holy. And what Korah means by that is every person here is as holy as another, including you, Moses, and including you, Aaron, so you don't get to tell us what to do. We're just as holy as you. The problem there is it wasn't a holiness contest that called Moses into his position. God called him into that position, right? They didn't have a contest where they were trying to decide who was the holiest person. God called Moses. Moses has plenty of struggles along the way. In fact, in theory, there could have been a person more holy than Moses somewhere in the camp. God didn't immediately say, sorry, Moses, I'm taking your authority away and I'm going to go give it to this person because they are now being holier. Right? God's appointed Moses for this role. And so their challenge against him, we're just as holy as you are, it sort of sounds good, but it doesn't recognize the authority structure that God has set up for them. What happens is he acts like he's protesting an injustice, but really he's rejecting the idea that God chooses and structures his own priesthood, his own society. There's resentment there. There's some ambition. There's a refusal to accept that this is how God has set it up. So the rebellion actually grows pretty quickly. There's lots of resentment out in the desert. There's plenty to go around. And it taps into this really, really familiar anxiety. The belief that God's guidance is unreliable and that human power struggles can secure what they fear God will not provide. Right? They fear that Moses' leadership is not going to get them the food that they need, that it's not going to win the battles that they're going to need to win in the promised land, that God's choice of Moses, God's choice of the power structure that they have, it's not going to work. And that's the people's anxiety all the way through the book of Moses. So Moses responds, bless him. Moses responds with humility. And he actually puts it all in God's hands. There's moments in Numbers where Moses does not respond well, but this is actually, he responds very well. He trusts that Heavenly Father is going to lead them, and it works. Here's what happens. Moses says, okay, if Korah and his followers die ordinary deaths, they die of old age, they die of an accident, they die of a heart attack, ordinary deaths, then that will mean God has not called and ordained Moses. If they get to live out their long lives, ordinary deaths, Moses says, well, that's proof God didn't actually call me. We'll consider you correct. But if something unprecedented happens, it will show that their challenge is really against God, not against Moses. So here's verses 31 to 34. I think this is in the ESV. As soon as he, Moses, finished saying all of this, the ground under them, Korah and all his leaders, the ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them and their households, and all those associated with Korah, together with all their possessions. They went down alive into the realm of the dead with everything they owned. The earth closed over them, and they perished and were gone from the community. At their cries, all the Israelites around them fled, shouting, "The earth is going to swallow us too." So it doesn't really get much more dramatic than that, right? Moses says, all right, if you guys die of old age, we'll say you were right. So if something dramatic happens, we're going to say, all right, we're trusting God. And almost immediately something does happen. They're swallowed up, and that was that. It's a very symbolic act, right? Those who tried to elevate themselves into leadership are brought down in the most literal way possible. The judgment isn't arbitrary. The judgment kind of matches, right? They have this ambition to be as high as Moses is in the authority structure, and God says, nope. I'm going to open up the earth, and the earth is going to swallow you down about as far as it can go. It's this visceral reminder that Israel's survival depends on trusting God. Depends on trusting the order that he has set up for them, rather than trying to shape it based on their personal desire or philosophy. So Korah's story becomes kind of this cautionary tale about entitlement. In the wilderness, Israel must learn that holiness is not like seized, it's received. And that God's presence rests where God chooses, not where human pride demands. God chose Moses. That was his choice. He didn't win a popularity contest. He didn't win any contest. God chose where his presence would rest, and it was on Moses. Together, these three stories reveal the people who know God's promises but struggle to live as if those promises are reliable. Sound familiar? Right? The book of Numbers shows us that the wilderness is not just this place of travel for them. It's kind of a classroom or a proving ground where trust is learned and tested and ultimately rewarded. If you are at the stage in your faith journey where you struggle to trust Heavenly Father's goodness towards you, or you struggle to trust him in any way, really, read through the book of Numbers. You will relate to what is going on here, the struggle that the people are having, and I hope you will be encouraged by the faithfulness of God that you see there. Read it in a translation you can understand, and what you will find is it's people just like you, struggling and sometimes winning and sometimes not winning, but they are struggling with their desire to trust God and their desire to be certain everything is absolutely going to work out, and how those two desires kind of rub against each other. You will also find evidence of a loving God who cares about his people and is extremely trustworthy. It's a fantastic book. I hope that you read it. I wish more Latter-day Saints were really familiar with the book of Numbers. Come back next week, and we're going to take on Deuteronomy, which is also fantastic. Trust me on this. And it is surprisingly relevant today. I will see you then.